Hey there and welcome back. Today we have a 700R4 core we're going to tear down and inspect to see what we're working with. This is going to be built up for a customer with a 1970 Chevelle, a beautiful white Chevelle with an engine making close to 600 horsepower. So I'll do a build strategy or build profile video on that. If you're familiar with my Nemesis series, think that plus an aftermarket drum and billet input shaft and a few other things. So purpose of today's exercise is to basically tear this thing apart, get it all cleaned up and prepped and ready for assembly, and also to determine what, if anything, we need to replace. Thinking probably reverse input drum, hopefully not too many other parts, but suffice to say, this was part of a customer trade-in deal for a 4L60E job. So Mel, if you're watching, Mel's a customer with the Chevelle. We decided to swap cores out. I was originally going to build you another 700R4 core, but that case was absolutely filthy, so we're going to work on this one instead. I'll get the camera a little bit closer and we'll begin. Alright, so for your shift linkage, your selector, we have a 15mm nut that needs to come off. And it has to be stubborn. So I know I've done a lot of videos on 700R4s, 4L60Es, and so at the risk of repeating kind of the same stuff I always repeat, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'll still cover areas of inspection or points of inspection you need to take into consideration and do, but I'll also discuss a couple other things with these transmissions that I've learned over the past, I'd say about a month and a half or so, that I haven't really discussed previously. So 10mm bolt on your speedo. So I want to say 89 or 90 and up, they went to these full electronic speedometers. Prior to that, it was an electromechanical setup. So you can buy these new, Rosper makes them. I would not recommend you reuse speed sensors in the 4L60Es because they can, basically, if they fail, not allow for any upshifts out of first gear. As I kind of fumble around with this thing. So there it is. With the 700R4s, that's not an issue, at least not with the speed sensors. You will run into problems with the governors for those things. If the governor gear is stripped, you'll have the same concern. Total lack of upshifts out of first gear. All right, 15mm on your extension housing. I already took the seal off. Come on. Not wanting to wind it out all the way for some reason. Okay, you're going to have your machine cut square seal here, just like any other extension housing on these transmissions of 4L60Es. And then here we see the governor. So one thing I'll make mention of is when it comes to 700R4s, I would say about 30 to 40% of my customers, and this probably holds true for at the macro level nationwide, are building these things for like resto mod or hot rod type applications and performance or very heavy duty type use. So there are two different generations of 700R4s, you probably know. There is 82 and 86 non-auxiliary valve body units, and then you have your 87 and up with the auxiliary valve body. Now the auxiliary valve body was an improvement. It softened and kind of made more pleasant that garage engagement into drive. It was the first time that these transmissions had a forward accumulator to speak of, so there are some key changes that you need to be aware of. Check out my 700R4 4L60E forward drum video. It takes you through all those changes in detail, but what I'm trying to get to here is you want to avoid the 82 to 86 units, especially the 82 to early 84, for anything performance oriented. And one thing I had read relatively recently, okay, the seal's like totally missing from this, is the 82 to 86 valve bodies can be a little tricky to calibrate for performance when it comes to the line bias valves. So it's not recommended you actually block that valve off. That's an otherwise very popular mod to do for 700 R4s because it gives you full line pressure. There's no bleed off. So for performance application, high stall, high RPM, it's recommended. For street-driven vehicles in tight to moderate stalls that are otherwise not considered high performance, it's probably not something you want to do. You just want to run a stiffer spring, either from the Transgo kits, Superior, or whomever makes shift kits for these units. They will provide you a spring that you could use that will shorten up that bleed off, kind of truncate it, so you're still getting the benefit without having forced line pressure, at all times, max line pressure. Now, when it comes to the 82 to 86 valve bodies, they can actually be vulnerable to blocking the line bias valve, and that has to do with their hydraulic circuitry for the 1-2 and to some extent the 2-3 shift and their corresponding downshifts. Okay, so get online from somebody that I know knows their stuff. I was going to say knows their SHIT, but somebody that probably has forgotten more than I'll ever know about these transmissions, and he had shared some experience that he had with numerous of the early units where he blocked the line bias valve, and all of a sudden the thing would shift really weird, stack shifting, out of time downshifts, things like that. Other shifting concerns that went away as soon as he unblocked the line bias valve and simply stuck a stiffer spring in there. Alright, so let's see what we're working with servo wise, if I can get the snap ring out. So anyway, that's the point I want to make. I'll come back to the governor real quick in just a second. So anyway, if you're going to run an earlier style valve body, which we're actually going to do here, I am not going to block the line bias valve despite the the horsepower level that will be applicable for his engine and stuff. So sometimes these servos are a little stubborn. What I'm trying to do is expose the cover so we can get at that O-ring there and take it out. Alright, what else? So as it relates to the servo itself, as you guys probably know, or most of you watching this probably know, 700R4s and especially 4L60Es have a relatively chronic problem with overly harsh 1-2 shifts, and there's a myriad of causes and reasons for that. And when you're calibrating your 1-2 shift, you need to be very, very cognizant of the entire setup that you're working with. Everything that you have done with respect to things like the 1-2 accumulator, the size of the second gear servo that you have installed, and so forth. All that stuff has to be taken into account when you're calibrating the firmness and the speed of that 1-2 shift. So, as I continue to struggle with this thing, one thing that I have learned, and this is going to apply mostly to high performance setups, is that when you are working with a vehicle that has a combination of the following attributes, including a very, very aggressive gear ratio, a cam that's what I would call medium size, something like 230, 236, somewhere in that neighborhood, and you're installing an aftermarket billet servo, you absolutely do not want to drill out the 1-2 feed orifice in the spacer plate beyond what it already is, unless your converter stall is greater than, I would say, 3,000 to 3,200, somewhere in there. Here the billet servos that I'm talking about are the Sonics Superhold servos and the Superior Tech Superhold servos. Both of them are going to have a much greater level of applied surface area than your 093 Corvette servo. So, and again, this goes back to my own personal experience relatively recently with that same transmission I mentioned earlier, the Nemesis, where we installed billet servos both in the second and fourth gear position, and unfortunately we had to recalibrate the 1-2 shift twice. First time I drilled it to 93 thousandths. The shifts were punishing to say the least, much more so than I anticipated. You know, given my knowledge and experience and time on 700 R4s, I know that they're A, a lot more forgiving, and B, your orifice sizes have to be a little bit bigger in proportion relative to 4L60Es. So anyway, I sent him another spacer plate with an 80 thousandths sized 1-2 feet orifice, and that turned out to be too big, too aggressive. So what he has done since is he's taken the plate down and peened it shut, peened that 1-2 orifice shut, and re-drilled it to 60 thousandths of an inch. I can't find my other pick here. All right, I'll use this one. So anyway, if you are working with a vehicle like that and you're installing billet turbos and you're doing something for performance, especially if engine power is in excess of 450 horsepower, which that customer's engine is. It's a 383 making about 475 horsepower or something like that. You want to be aware of that dynamic when it comes to mechanical shift calibration in the 700 R4s. So you almost have to treat it like it's a 4L60E. Alright, so let's see if we can get this pan off. Let me just kind of speak about the governor. Always replace your governor gears. Don't ever reuse them. And then the main check you want to do is to make sure that the governor valve is moving when you work the weights. Okay, if it's not moving, when you take the roll pin out to replace the gear, get the valve out. If it's stuck or seized, I would just buy another governor, good used, that actually moves or where the valve is not stuck. But if you can get it out, then take bench buddies and polish the inside of the bore. Make sure you check it for anything unusual, scoring, damage, etc., etc. But most of the time when they're seized like that, I just replace them with another governor and call it a day. All right, so end plate check. 15 to 35 thousandths, that's what you want to see. This feels like it's about 30. And end plate will typically open up a little bit, anywhere from about, I'll say 5, maybe 7 thousandths of an inch, relative to what you measure dry on the bench during reassessment. So you can run it a little tight, down to 10 thou. Because chances are, its working end play will probably be closer to 15, and that's perfectly fine. 25 thousandths, maybe 30 thou in the extreme high end for stock applications. High performance, I recommend between 10 and 25 thousandths. So 13 millimeter on all of these pump to case bolts. All right, 732 pump. That's the last 3 digits of the casting. 4732 are the last 4. You can use these pumps in early 4L60Es, 93, 94, and you can retro those pumps back to these 700 R4s all the way back, and that also applies to the 303 pump bodies. Okay, you can also, believe it or not, adapt 4L60E pumps to work in 700 R4s, but if it's an auxiliary valve body application, you have to modify the pump to open up a conduit for the the tube that runs from the auxiliary valve body to the pump. That's going to be your forward feed tube. Okay, check rotation of the output shaft. Spin both shafts, make sure they're not bound or not unified, so to speak. Here I'm spinning them in opposite directions. They appear to be fine. Alright, so let's get the pan off and see what we're working with. Alright, fluid doesn't look horrible. It smells a little bit, but it's not the worst I've seen. Change that camera angle a little bit. Hey, 13 millimeter on all pan bolts. They all get 98 to 100 inch-pounds of torque. Okay, I think he's going to be putting a deep pan onto this thing. So, factory pan will probably be put on with a couple of bolts, no gasket, just so that he can maneuver it. And then I think he's going to put a deep pan on once he has the thing installed and TV cable set up and adjusted and all that good stuff. All right, 15 millimeter on your rear trans mount bolts. Okay, never reuse the trans mounts unless it has been recently replaced. I mean, if it looks like this, obviously you replace that. You never rerun something like that. That will likely cause damage to the transmission, especially in a high articulation application or high performance where there's, I mean, 5, 6, 7,000 plus RPM. All right, so the usual, burnt fluid in the bottom of the pan, probably the 3/4 clutch, maybe the band. Let's see if this gasket is bonded to the pan itself. If I can get it off. Now, it's coming off in chunks. I'll mess with it later. All right. So if you've not worked on these transmissions before, you may want to go ahead and take a picture of the routing. Let's get this filter out of the way first. Let that drain. Okay, fairly straightforward deal. There were, based on pressure switch configuration, there were 4 different versions or 4 different combinations of pressure switches. Very early units had 4, then they stopped it down to 2, and then eventually 1. I'm gonna get this pan out of the way because it is absolutely disgusting. Alright, so 13 millimeter on your detank roller. Locate the socket, that is. If I can't, then your SOL. And then all these other bolts will take 10 millimeter except for this bolt here, that's going to be 8 millimeter. It's nice to see that the golden bolt along with the little hold down clamp is present. A lot of times the 700R4s, these two things are not, they're not in the transmission when you take off the pan. And that sucks because sometimes they're hard to find, especially the little hold down clamp. So if you have a hard part supplier in your neck of the woods, Transtar distributor, something like that, then they may have what's called a miscellaneous parts bin or catch bin. So they just take this kind of stuff and throw it all in there. If so, rummage through that bin, especially if you build 700R4s fairly frequently. This way you could stock up on spares for these little hard to find parts. The mechanical speedo gear clamp, although Transtar does sell them over the counter, they are available in the aftermarket. Alright, 1-2 accumulator. So 700R4s and early 4L60Es, 93, 94, will have this style accumulator. It's called the First Design. It's a large hole accumulator with a large diameter pin, and this is representative casting number, ends in 7344. Okay, always replace your accumulators. Never reuse them. So we're probably going to do a pinless accumulator in here, and I'll run that with the stock Sonic spring. This is going to be mostly a street-driven car. He's not going to race it around, at least not as far as I know. But like I said, for anything with a moderately stalled converter, you really don't want to get too aggressive with that 1-2 shift in terms of the things you do in the accumulator and the accumulator regulator valve and valve body. Band clearance has to be tightly controlled and managed. 1/8 to 3/16 of travel between the band and the drum. So if you're moving the band longitudinally like that along the drum with a flat blade screwdriver, you don't want to see any more than 1/8 to about 3/16 of an inch. Beyond that, you start to run into trouble where there's just too much band apply. It's harsh, late shift, and that'll eventually cause damage to the band and possibly other parts if it's really, really bad. So unlike Ford and Dodge transmissions, there's no band adjustment per se, at least not with a band adjustment screw. And again, I mean, I know you guys know this and watch these videos all the time, work on these transmissions, but if you're somebody new, somebody's used to Ford units and Dodge, then you know these bands are not adjustable in the traditional sense. All right, so that 8mm bolt needs to come out. All right, wiring harness will not be reused, though the harnesses in these are fairly resilient, more so than the 4L60s and 4L80s. So if you can't find a new harness, or you're working on an earlier model and a harness is not available, it's got more pressure switches than just the one, then you can rerun your harness. Just check it for any kind of signs of damage to the insulation, exposed wiring and such. But the solenoids can be sold, or are sold separately. They're made by Fitzall and a few other companies. You could also buy an OEM AC Delco solenoid for your TCC and just splice it in right here and use either shrink wrapping or those kind of screw-in connectors. I'm not an electrician, I don't know what the hell they're called, but they actually are what I prefer to use because they make things nice and neat. So this harness appears to be in good shape. I'm going to set it aside, clean it up with some quick dry cleaner, and save it for later. We're going to be running a first-gen valve body that does everything through the valve body as far as torque converter clutch control. I know I have one more bolt here. So basically how I like to set those kits up for most street vehicles is to put the stiffest spring that comes in the torque converter clutch control valve kit. I typically will use the Transgo version. I've used the Superior Tech version as well, but the Transgo version is my preference. So auxiliary valve body, make sure you have your check ball here at this location. That's where it goes. Okay, don't leave that out. Problems will ensue if you do. Okay, I'll take that little valve body apart later. All right, another thing you want to check, and I'll bring it back here in a second once the valve body's out of the way, is going to be your TV bracket. So you want to make sure that this is not bent. Every once in a while I'll see one come in all bent out of shape. It'll be bent forward. These slots for the bolts will be all boogered up, and you'll want to replace it if you can't repair it or fix it. Come on, give it up. All right, linkage arm. So we have clear signs of overheating, bonded gaskets, which obviously these don't take. So the gaskets have been heat bonded to the plate. So the easiest way to get gaskets off of the spacer plate like this when they're bonded is to use a high pressure washer. Alright, so take this out to the cleaning area and use a pressure washer, and that pressure washer will basically act as a liquid blade, like a liquid razor blade, just like you saw a few minutes ago, and it'll cut this gasket right off. So this way you're not sitting here spending hours and hours trying to get the damn thing off. Now we're not going to reuse this plate. It's going to be replaced by a Transgo 700P plate, but it's still a good plate. I mean, you can repair these plates with Fitzall repair sleeves if the check ball locations are all worn out. 700R4s, I don't see it too much. 4L60Es is a very common problem, the 1-2 shift check ball location, so you always want to check that. And then for check balls here, for these late models, 88 to 92 or 87 to 92, you have two check balls here in the valve body. You will not have a check ball here. Don't put a check ball there if you're running an auxiliary valve body on these later units. 1993 was 1 year only for 700R4s and only in passenger cars as far as I know, and they added a third check ball, and I believe it was somewhere down here, and that was for the reverse input drum and reverse input clutch. Alright, let's get this fourth accumulator out. So fourth accumulator pistons, again, never reuse them. This looks like to be a standard spring, perfectly fine. We are going to block the fourth accumulator in this thing, and then we're going to put a 4L60E accumulator spring with a piston in there. because that actually helps facilitate the function of the 1-2 accumulator. So that's something I learned from Transgo. I have a short video out on it discussing that particular aspect of blocking the 4th accumulator circuit. All right, let me show you check balls for the case. So these late models, you have a TV exhaust check ball here. Most of the time builders will not reinstall that. I always do. I mean, it's basically there in the event your TV cable snaps. GM was getting a lot of warranty claims for TV cables coming basically loose or snapping in half, and that would burn up the transmission. As you guys know, the throttle valve system is what manages and regulates line pressure in these 700R4s and the 204Rs as well as the AODs. So that cable snaps, then you're screwed unless you have a safety check ball here, and that will seat and max the line pressure, at least allow you to limp the transmission home so that you can do what you need to do, replace the TV cable, readjust it, and get it all dialed in again. Okay, so no check ball in this bathtub location here, 2 check balls here, a check ball here, and a check ball for the 3-4. You'll leave this check ball out when you block the 3-4 accumulator, if in fact that's what you're going to be doing. Okay, 13 millimeter on your parking pole guide plate. That's parking pole guide plate. And then 15 millimeters on your rooster cone to selector shaft nut. Just beat it forward, and then take your flat blade screwdriver to remove the little band, little spacer here. That comes right out. And then sometimes the selector will give you grief. In fact, most of the time they will. If you guys watch enough of my videos, you know that I'm constantly fighting with them. So this is the orientation. Ooh. This is the orientation for your rooster comb and your parking rod assembly, if you're not already familiar. So obviously the little engagement arm here for your manual valve linkage faces the valve valve. All right, let me grab these check balls. That's all of them. All right, let's see if I can pry this out. Don't leave the selector in here until until later. You want to make sure the band and drum and all that are still in the case so that you have something to pry against. And this should come out by prying and beating on it like so. Alright, now I want to see if I can get this band anchor pin out of the way. Perfect. So that's always good news when you can do that, because otherwise if this thing is stuck in here or some sort of severe damage to the band or something else went wrong, a lot of times when you try to take the pump out, the drum will want to come with it, and then what will happen is the band will grab the drum because it's all cockeyed now, and you'll struggle to get it out, or at least I do. You know, maybe you guys are a lot cleaner at this than I am, you know, a lot more fluid. You just flow through the case, whereas I kind of stumble through it. Alright, so pump. So now we can extract the drums cleanly. And then we have our sun gear and our band. So band has seen better days, clear signs of overheating. You'd never reuse the band, but if you want to, look for different things for diagnostic purposes or try to understand symptoms and tie them to direct causes, you can always check the apply points to see if there's any damage, any delamination of the band. That could be an indicator that moisture or water has gotten into the transmission. All right. So notice the low roller clutch rotation. So it'll always spin clockwise and it'll always lock counterclockwise. When you're doing your air check for the low reverse clutch, have this in there. And when you put air into that low reverse clutch feed, you will not be able to move this. It'll be locked up tight, and that's what you want. That tells you that the low reverse clutch pack is working and the circuit is healthy. All right, let me grab snap ring pliers. All right, these snap rings shouldn't be reused. There's new ones available that come in the kits. So any 700R4 4L60E overhaul or paper and rubber kit you buy, they will have these. They will have them new. All right, so you have your sun shell, the 4-tab thrust washer, you have your front planet, and you have your 3/4 clutch hub and your reaction shaft. So check your bearing. Bearings are perfectly fine to reuse as long as they're in good shape. Same with the planets. Okay, one thing I'll make mention here, you do not need to run 5-pinion front or rear planets in these units. They're frankly not worth the money unless you're already working with a 4L65E to begin with, and for 700R4s you really don't need them. Okay, 2 bushings, one here in the reaction shaft. If you're going to reuse your reaction shaft, you would always replace those bushings. Do not reuse any bushings in these transmissions. If you cannot replace your bushings yourself, then you can always take the bushings and the parts that accept bushings to a transmission shop, and they can R&R them for you for a small fee plus the cost of the bushing kit. Okay, check these engagement splines here. You'll notice the beginnings of some wear. All right, sometimes they are severely worn where you have literally just a sliver of spline left all the way around. If you see that, then discard the reaction shaft. Okay, check these splines as well. 4L70Es had induction hardened splines on their reaction shafts. You could purchase those separately and retro them to any year 700R4. For your 3/4 clutch hub / forward ring gear, check these splines, or excuse me, these lugs. Okay, a lot of times you'll see a lot of chatter right here, and this will cause the 3/4 clutch pack to kind of hang up a little bit. While it's not a huge contributor to 3/4 clutch failure, it can play a role. Okay, this thrust washer is in good shape. We're using a Sonic Smart Shell, so it'll be eliminated in this build, but you know, if the thrust washer is no good, obviously just replace it. Okay, same with sun shell. 700R4 sun shells, I don't see crack too often. It's more of a problem with 4L60Es, but you always replace this with, at minimum, a heat-treated shell that has splines that are in fact heat-treated. Okay, they like to separate at the neck and fracture, and then if that happens, you lose reverse, second, and fourth gear. No good. Okay, rear sun gear. Let's see if I can grab it with pliers, because I obviously can't do it with my bare hands. So both Durabond and Sonics make wide rear sun gear bushings. The sun gear bushings from Sonics have been giving me grief lately. I've had to clearance them, and that is no good. I mean, that's basically a waste of my time. So I'm going to be using the Durabond bushings from now on, including in this build. All right, I use a big pick to get at the snap ring for the center support. See if I can find the anti-clunk spring. We're going to be putting a bolt-in support in here. So the bolt-in support will take the place of the existing center support anti-clunk spring. So anytime you have real high performance, you know, a lot of horsepower and whatnot, you don't really want to use the anti-clunk spring. You really want to go with, at minimum, a case saver. All right. So I wanted to stay out of the way of that inevitable splashback with transmission fluid. It went over there. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the shop air on, and I'm going to see if I can get this center support out by forcing it out via the low reverse piston. Something that one of my viewers had mentioned to me as a good technique. Larry, and he volunteers a lot of information, shares a lot of really good tips and tricks. So if you see him in the comments, it's Larry Sham. Definitely take note of the information he shares. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and turn the shop air on. We need to do that because I want to pressure test that forward drum, and we'll get the case evacuated and then go through the pump and drums. Alright, so now what we're going to do is take snap ring pliers, and we need to locate the anti-clunk spring there in the case, and we're going to take the pliers and kind of wedge them between the case lug and the spring itself and open them up so that we can force the one side of the anti-clunk spring past the lug on the center support. And then from there, we're going to take shop air and put it in the low reverse feed passage so we can force everything, including the support, forward so that we can take it out of the case. So let's locate that anti-clunk spring. So the way I have the case oriented, it's going to be right here, right between the gap in the deck surface for the pump. Alright, so we got it kind of collapsed. Now I'm going to come in and force everything forward. Let's see if that works. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Alright, got the inner race out for the little roller clutch. And we're able to work the center support out. Alright, so at this point, you should be able to kind of tap the output shaft out the back of the case. And we can see sometimes the heat and maybe a little bit of rust there on the shaft itself. So you always want to check your worm drive gears, check your splines, make sure that they're not chipped or fractured. These output shafts are pretty resilient in normal course of use, assuming the vehicle itself is healthy. In other words, no problems with the rear end. If the rear end blows up, especially while the thing's in lockup, then it's possible the output shaft will snap on you. But they're pretty resilient otherwise. So here's the rest of the gear train, along with the rest of our low reverse clutch pack. Come on, give it up. Alright, these clutches appear to be in decent shape. So we got a mix of Borg Warner and actually all Borg Warner maybe. Let me see. See what these are. Are they Borg Warner or are they something else? I have no idea on the history of this unit. The customer that brought it to me, I don't believe he knows either. So it's hard to say if this thing's been overhauled before, and so to what extent. I haven't seen the obvious signs that it's been going through, but then again, I haven't honestly really been looking either, so maybe you guys have noticed something that I haven't. Okay, check that bearing. Check your pinions. Check vertical, check horizontal, you know, for side play. You don't want any side play, you want basically a relatively minimal amount of vertical play. Check these splines in here, check structure, check lugs, check in here. Okay, a lot of times if this goes bad, you'll hear growling or, you know, other related noises in first gear only, and then it'll go away once you shift to second gear. Okay, for ring gear, again, check bearing. Check the reaction shaft splines. You can replace this independent of your parking gear / ring gear. Check teeth. This appears to be in good shape. These bearings out of the way. So, like I said, we're going to be running the Smart Shell. The Smart Shell, it will replace the factory race with the race that comes with the kit from Sonics. So you will not reuse that race. You will not reuse this black 4-tab thrust washer either. You delete that and you replace it with the bearing that comes with the Smart Shell. So the little roller clutch assembly is not a high failure rate item. Sorry, you didn't see me take the snap ring out. All I did was pry here on one of these 2 tabs to wedge it out, and that's it. But not a high failure rate item. However, for anything high performance, I recommend you always replace this along with your input sprag. So, and another reason why you don't want to use early 700 R4s is, I want to say the 82 to 84 versions use the same basic center support as the TH350s, and they had a very narrow roller clutch assembly. And they also used a 24 element sprag assembly, except for the very, very early 82 units, they actually had a roller clutch assembly. It was a, in place of the traditional dogwood style sprag, they actually had a 7 element roller assembly in there. And that roller assembly was prone to failure. So, not a good idea to run that. So we had a straggler check ball. Alright, I need to put the tool in here to compress the low reverse clutch return spring assembly, and then we'll use these snap ring pliers to pop out the snap ring so that we can have the case fully empty, and then we'll go through the drums. Alright, we have the tool position. The snap ring ends themselves are approximately the 3 o'clock location. And so I'm just going to take my 90-degree snap ring pliers, get into the snap ring groove and spread the two ends, and then I have a long pick in the event that the snap ring wants to fight me, so that if I need to, I can spread it out and get the pick in between the back side of the snap ring and the groove to prevent it from collapsing back into the groove. Alright, so where this thing is positioned, it's literally right on a locking bolt, so that'll be real difficult to get out, so I'm actually going to move it and move it up a little bit so that the two ends can clear that locking bolt. Alright, so now I'm going to go in with the pliers. And pull it out. So I know you couldn't see all that, but that thing was going to fight me. Here it is. So if the snap ring itself wants to stay in there, just take like a pry bar or something, tap on it, and it'll come out. And then just make sure the return spring assembly isn't bent up. Sorry, should have zoomed out. You know, make sure it's not all bent out of shape or whatever. This one looks okay. But sometimes, if they're real stubborn coming out, you know, the return spring assembly itself will be compromised. All right. So let's take the piston out. And now we have the casing. I'm going to set it up over here. Kind of get it out of the way. And then let me bring over the drums, and then we'll tackle the pump last. So let me move you a little bit so you can see into each drum, and then we'll start taking everything apart. Alright, you got your thrust washer on the back side of the stator. Both these thrust washers, stick them over there. Okay, reverse input clutch is usually not burnt. You know, you normally don't see too many issues with this thing smoked. If you do have a burnt clutch, scrutinize the sealing rings on the pump itself, as well as the sealing ring groove diameter here in the inner portion of the drum. This drum's actually in pretty decent shape from a band surface perspective. Normally they're all bent and burnt and warped and whatnot, but this one superficially looks pretty good. Now, the only surefire way to tell is to take a straight edge with a flashlight, shine the flashlight, you know, right in the back side of the straight edge underneath. If you see any gap or light shining through, you know that the drum's warped. Alright, so I'll set that aside. Just a little bit of heat here on one of the frictions. So check your backing plate, make sure it's not blued and, you know, tons of slip marks from slipping and other whatnot. So these look like bore warners to me. We do see some signs of heat there on the inner diameter or inner portion, especially on this one. So again, it kind of squares with the general pattern of overheating that we've seen in this unit so far. And that tells me that either it was not very well maintained, or it was kind of used and abused, or, you know, both. Alright, separate the low reverse clutch a little bit. The steels are in good shape. We're going to put a whole new steel module in here, probably use Colleen's wherever we can. That's typically what I'll do with high performance 700s or 4L60Es, but you know, you don't necessarily need to do that in every application. Okay, so now we're going to take a look-see at the forward drum. As I mentioned earlier, we're not going to reuse this drum. We're going to use an aftermarket drum that the customer had purchased specifically for this build. But what I want to do is check the you know, the sealing integrity at the apply circuit, where the drum, or where the shaft I should say, is pressed into the drum. All right, here's your selective washer. This looks like a number 69. This is actually what I see most commonly, either that or 70. 68 too. It's rare I see anything other than those three numbers. So the smaller the number, the thinner the washer. Scrutinize these sealing rings too. I mean, you'd never reuse them, but if you have burnt frictions in either the forward, coast clutch, or 3/4 clutch pack, you want to just check these to make sure that you know, they could or could not explain you know, that condition. So Teflon sealing rings, once they're installed and you know they're in there correctly, they're pretty resilient. But again, you don't really reuse these on an overhaul. I mean, that would not be proper. You always replace them. So I want to get rid of these real quick, and then I'm going to pour some transmission fluid here at the base of the pocket, and we'll go ahead and do our drum pressure test. Get rid of that, get rid of that. You don't need a ton of fluid, just enough to fill that cavity. Now I'm going to move you up a little bit so you have a better view. Alright, so what we're looking for here is bubbles at the base of the shaft here in the pocket. Bubbles in the fluid when we start charging each of these apply circuits. So this is going to be your 2-3 feed, in other words second to third, so 3/4 clutch pack apply circuit. This is going to be your forward apply circuit, and then this here is going to be your coast clutch. When we do the coast clutch, we got to plug the forward apply circuit hole with a finger. So let's see, 3/4. Okay, you want to charge this circuit numerous times, and really that applies to all of them, because sometimes bubbles won't appear right away. But then after the 4th or 5th you know, repetition, you start to see the bubbles. Now, there are schools of thought that you should kind of heat this drum up to operating temperature and test it then, and that's very valid. There's some drums that will pass the pressure test at room temperature, but they'll fail at operating temperature. Forward drum. Alright, good solid apply. I'm not hearing any hissing coming from inside the drum. That's a good sign. It tells me the forward piston housing is probably okay, but we won't know until we actually get this thing back together if we were to reuse this drum and air check it dry. That's how you'll really know if that forward piston housing is good or not. Alright, coast clutch. See how air is staying trapped in the circuit? That's good news. Alright. So that's how you pressure test one of these things. So I think we've seen my first sign that this has been going through, and that's this Viton rubber seal here. Whoever rebuilt this transmission, they knew what they were doing, at least in this regard, because they have the Viton rubber 4L60E lube seal installed instead of the 700R4 plastic seal that comes in all the overhaul kits in the aftermarket for these transmissions, and GM has long since stopped selling kits for these things. Alright, now what we see here is no good. Alright, and I'm not talking about the load release springs, although that's part of the problem. I'm talking about how they set this 3/4 clutch pack up. It's got quite a lot of clearance. 700R4s are not as sensitive to 3/4 clutch clearance as 4L60Es are, so you can set them up a little looser, not, you know, a tremendous amount, mind you, but a little bit looser. There is some margin for error. So let's see what we got here. Actually, let me put the put this back in here and put the backing plate back in, and we can see the clearance. So obviously we have way too much clearance. I mean, way too much. This looks like, I would probably guess a full 1/8 of an inch, maybe a 1/4. I mean, the clutch worked, but you could see signs of overheating in here. I mean, all these friction discs show signs of being burnt partially or totally. And then we have a spacer seal, and then we have our apply plate. These are free of legs, because then you have your apply support, support ring, if you will, for $700. 4L60Es, they did away with this, and you know, as you guys know, they have the one-piece supply plate with the legs. So they're running, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They should have ran a 7 clutch stack in here. All right. So 3/4 clutch on its way out. This would have started to slip severely at any point if it wasn't already when the vehicle's on the road. So again, 3/4 clutch pack setup is so important for these transmissions and 4L60Es. And if you don't get that right, you know, you kind of doom the transmission to an early failure, early demise. You set it up for failure, I should say. Come on. See what happens when I try to walk and chew gum at the same time? Plus, it's kind of awkward doing this like this. I should have had this thing set up in that hole in the bench, but that would have made too much sense. You know, we don't do things like that around here. All right, forward clutch. Let's see what we have. All right, I'll come back to the drum itself real quick when I look at the casting number, last 3 digits. But the forward clutch looks half decent, pretty good actually. The steels look in good shape. I don't see any obvious signs. Well, I guess a couple of indicators of slipping. I actually think a forward clutch steel module may have been put in here in addition to a direct clutch steel mod, maybe a whole steel mod. So I see the coast clutch looks pretty good. These are exity frictions, I think. So this circuit tested healthy. I'm not surprised to see all the frictions and steels backing plates in good shape. Here's the coast clutch, and here's the forward. All right, let's come back to the drum. This is going to be an 097 drum. You can see the casting there. Last 3 digits are 097. So this will work in any 700R4 as long as you're running a large hole or large diameter stator shaft in your pump. And they will also work in 4L60Es all the way up to 2000 as long as it's paired with a small block Chevy engine application. Okay, this Viton seal is rock hard. I mean, it's almost like plastic. It's not, but it's not sealing very well. And lube circuitry may have been compromised as a result. However, we did not observe any signs of lube-related failures in the unit. So it was like right on the edge of taking a shit, in other words. Right on the edge. When this thing was pulled out, it was pulled out just in time. Alright. If you're going to have a problem with low reverse, chances are it's going to be this machine cut seal here. They like to harden, and over time, you know, that'll allow for fluid to blow by. And of course, one thing leads to another, and you start slipping in reverse. And when that starts happening, you know, it's time to pull the unit. No amount of stop slip or transmission fix in a bottle is going to save the unit at that point. And this one feels like it's a little bit hardened to me. I don't have any problems getting it out of here. Okay, this is the bearing for the sprag. We'll open that up in a second. I know I'm kind of going all over the place here. I'm just grabbing parts as I see them, and I don't know why this is giving me grief, other than the fact that it is, as I just described, partially hardened. I mean, it just does not want to come out. There we go. And yeah, that's exactly what it was. So right here. Okay. So again, right on the edge of taking a dump. And look at the frictions again. They look okay, but that wouldn't have been the case for much longer. So that's for a drum. There's aluminum pistons in here. Never reuse aluminum apply pistons or 700R4s and early 4L60Es 93 through 96 because The forward piston in particular likes to crack. I've seen numerous 700R4s come in with cracked forward pistons and totally smoked forward clutch packs. It's bad news. Alright, time for the pump. So this thing was overhauled. I imagine it was overhauled in the distant past. Oh, you know what? Sprag first. Let's do the sprag first. Oop, let's do the sprag first, and then we'll go ahead and do the pump, because we want to take a look and see what, if anything, we may find here that could be remarkable. I mean, what we're concerned about is heavily worn outer sprag race on the inner diameter, as well as a scored up inner race, one that is not mirrory smooth. Alright, so best practice with these for the outer sprag race is to take some sandpaper, 320 grit, or emery cloth, go all the way around to reintroduce cross hatching. Otherwise, inspect this. Make sure that you cannot physically feel any damage. If you see this inner portion here where the sprag element actually rides, right in here between the two witness marks, or witness lands, if this is really, really shiny, discard the race. That would tell me that it is heavily worn. So at risk of rolling over and failing. Otherwise, just check the lugs, check the rest of the structure, make sure it's good, make sure these lube holes are not restricted, and that's true of everything, the input shaft, the output shaft, make sure there's nothing clogged up in there that could restrict the flow of fluid. Okay, the sprag itself, this I think is a new sprag in the sense it was replaced during an overhaul. So, like I said, whoever did this, they did care for some important aspects of these transmissions when it comes to rebuilding them. They replaced the sprag. They may have replaced the low roller clutch as well. New friction module. I believe a steel module was installed. I mean, the steels kind of they just look as if they were new to me anyway. You may beg to differ. I don't know. Let's see if I can get this damn thing off. Currently struggling with some stuff today. Nothing unusual, unfortunately. Alright, so this is kind of what you want to see here on an inner race. You see how nice, mirrory smooth surface that is? And that looks like a piece of hair or something. So, if you see scoring here, signs of heat damage, bluing and whatnot, do not reuse that sprag assembly. Okay, here you want to pay attention for cracks. Real high performance, Sonics has a billet steel coast clutch hub, so that will eliminate a failure point in high performance units. And then of course the sprag itself you'll replace with the Borg Warner 29 element. Okay, prior 700R4s, 82 to 86 had the 24 element, and it is not recommended that you use them at all. Alright, pump. So we have scarf cut Teflon sealing rings, a perimeter O-ring, and a 732 body. Get that O-ring out of the way. So bushings, these need to be replaced. Worn bushings here can cause converter clutch issues at the rear location, and in the front also needs to be replaced as well. Alright, 13 millimeter on these bolts. They take 15 foot-pounds. Alright, like all pumps, check the inner diameter for sealing ring groove wear. I don't see it too much in the 700R4s and relatively early 4L60Es up through late 05 or early 06. For whatever reason, 07 and up, I've seen ring cut in here because the turbine shaft or input shaft, the sealing ring grooves there would pinch together and it would bind the sealing rings. They can't kind of rotate freely, so they start cutting grooves into the inner diameter of the stator. The other thing you want to watch for is worn stator splines. These aren't too bad. In a factory application, I'd probably reuse these, but for what we're doing, this whole stator is not going to be reused because it's not hardened or heat treated or what have you. It's not really for performance, but if you had if you had spline wear like this, if the splines were worn out, then just replace it with a replacement stator. And that's it. Alright. Pump body. Drain some of this fluid out of here. All right, you can retro a 13 vane pump back to a 7 or a 10 vane housing. That's fine. The 13 vane slides are a little different than the 7 and 10 vanes. So you see these, whatever you want to call these here. Okay, these insets on the 13 vane pumps. It's real small on one of the sides. So that's how you can tell the difference. And I know I'm getting my terminology all screwed up here, but the rotor and the slide, each of them for OEM are pretty resilient. I mean, you could run a billet rotor too for anything super high performance, but I'll be honest, in my experience, I found that it's not necessary. I used to install them, very early in my career because I thought that they were like mandatory for anything even remotely performance, but I've learned over the years that as long as your housings are machined to spec and you're pumped to the deck surface here and the top of the rotor and the top of the slide are between 1 and 2 thousandths, then you'll never have issues. And that's provided that the person installing the transmission doesn't accidentally allow the converter to slip off and then destroy it when he fires up the engine. Alright, here is your pivot pin and little spring. Don't lose them. And you go right there, and then your working surface, I mean, you can check it if you want. I never do because I always machine them. I mean, it doesn't make sense not to. So sometimes one of these will come in and you could tell somebody prepped the surface with like sandpaper and whatnot. I mean, that's fine too. If you're going to use like 1500 grit, something like that, that's how you want to finish it and wet sand it. And I mean, that will kind of even out some high spots, but that's if there is almost no kind of scoring whatsoever, or it's super, super light. But I mean, anything beyond that, you're machining the pump. Okay, this bushing is worn out to all hell. Obviously, seal's going to be removed. And then there is the drain back that's right here. You can drill this out to 5/16. We're going to do that here with this body. So that'll be taken to the machine shop. And then as far as your valving, you want to make sure you vacuum test the PR valve here, the balance spool end, because if this is really, really worn out here, like the casting itself, and it's not holding much vacuum, you put the rotor and slide at risk of breakup and failure. Okay, for your TCC ply valve, test here and test at this orifice, and when you test at this orifice, you put a finger and you plug it. You see how I'm plugging it, and it's pushing fluid out because it's sealing that circuit. That's basically it. So I actually put this in the wash with the valves in there so I could test it as soon as it comes out after I blow dry it, and then I'll take it apart. Because if I need to, I'll just ream the casting with the Sonix reamer for the pressure regulator valve location and put an oversized valve in there. Alright, let me back this up a little bit and then we'll summarize. Alright, all in all, not too bad. This is a core, so it's not like we had drivability symptoms that we were going to try and diagnose and pinpoint the direct causes of. But from what we've seen, this thing, it was literally right on the edge of taking a dump. And maybe I'll title the video to something to that effect. But it was, the 3/4 clutch had literally a 1/4 inch clearance. At least that's what it looked like to me. You saw heavy stress on that pack as well as the reverse input clutch, which again is kind of abnormal. So a rock hard input-output shaft junction seal for your lube. That's never a good sign, and I'm glad that whenever this thing was taken out of the vehicle, it was taken out when it was, because it was literally right on the edge of a catastrophic failure. Okay, the pump looked largely unremarkable. In other words, nothing unusual from what we usually see in transmissions with X amount of miles on them, and this thing seems like it has quite a lot of miles. I believe it was overhauled at some point in the distant past, not the recent past, at least in terms of its mileage, unless somebody just straight up used and abused it, but I don't see any real signs of that here other than maybe having it run a little low on fluid, because that can also cause some of the signs of overheating that we've seen, like gaskets bonded to the spacer plate, for example. The band surface on the reverse drum is decent, the lugs look decent. I mean, that's a good drum. It just needs a little bit of sanding, 400 grit all the way around, or you can chuck it up in a lathe and do it that way. The pump needs reconditioning, you know, all the usual remachining of the two castings. We're going to R&R the stator with a heavy duty version, and then you know, do what we need to do with the hydraulics. That drum is in good shape, though we're not going to reuse it because we have another drum. But you want to check down here these lugs. If there is a failure, especially a bearing failure, a lot of times this will come into hard contact with the front gear set, and it'll basically be destroyed all the way around here, the mouth of the drum. Check these lugs too. Make sure that they're not going to hang up reverse input clutches. If they had a whole bunch of grooves dug deep in them, then that could also explain what we saw on the friction discs in the reverse input clutch pack. Okay, all the gears seem to be fine. You know, planetaries, ring gear, sun gear, rotor and slide and the pump are good. Check the bores in the case. You're basically going to do all these things that I'm mentioning, not now, but after everything's cleaned up. So once everything's nice and clean, check all this stuff. And if you see anything that, you know, looks out of the ordinary, shouldn't be there, you need to, you know, replace or recondition. One more thing I want to check with the low reverse clutch pack, I didn't mention this, and that is the seals. Alright, so here's your cushion plate. Alright, I'm going to put that aside because that's not part of what I want to bring up. I mean, 82 to 86, they had reverse input pistons that were a little taller and no cushion plate, so don't mix and match. But take a close look at all the steels. Put them together like this and see if you see any steel plate that's wider than the others. See if any steel plate has a number on the either the notch or one of these lugs. That steel needs to be saved, assuming it's in good shape, because it's a selective steel. So when you go to put your reverse clutch together, the low reverse clutch, you're going to take, alright, I'm going to make sure you can see, you're going to take the center support here, and then you're going to stack the whole clutch pack up and then measure the height from this part of the lug, the bottom of the lug, to the top friction should be between 1.2 and 1.240 inches, I believe. So if it's not, then you'll need a selective steel. If it is, you're good. That's the only way I know of to measure low reverse clutch pack clearance. So anyway, last little tidbit for you. Other than that, this core is largely unremarkable, which from a transmission builder's perspective, that's what you want. From an entertainment value standpoint, maybe not as much. Alright guys, well that's the video. Thanks so much for watching, greatly appreciate it. As always, let me know if there's anything else you want me to focus on or any topics you want me to cover, and I'll prioritize the video as soon as I can. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and once again, thank you so much for spending your valuable time on my channel. I greatly appreciate it.